My father-in-law barged into the delivery room and tried to hit me, endangering my baby before my husband restrained him. 3 weeks ago, I, 24F, was in the delivery room with my husband, Theo, 27M, when my father-in-law, George, 54M, stormed in uninvited and tried to hit me. Yep, no typo, he tried to assault me while I was in the middle of delivering our child. My husband grabbed him by the throat before he could touch me. Hospital security escorted him out, and the stress caused our baby to become distressed. That's the TLDR. Now for the backstory that led to this point. Theo and I have been married for 2 years. From early in our relationship, his father has been a problem. I cut contact with my own father when I was 18 due to years of emotional abuse I won't detail here. Because of this, I initially questioned whether I was judging George unfairly based on my past. It didn't take long to realize that George was genuinely problematic. He makes racist comments at family gatherings and belittles Theo's career choices. He speaks to his wife, Martha, 52F, as if she's beneath him. I get along wonderfully with Martha. It's a completely different relationship than the one we have with my father-in-law. She's not a mother-in-law as such. She has become a dear friend over the years, which makes this situation even more complicated. I want to make it clear I don't have a problem with men in general. My stepfather has been an incredible support in my life. My brother and I are incredibly close. My problem isn't with men, it's with abusive people. Last year, Theo and I found out I was pregnant. We were overjoyed but decided to wait to share the news. I'd had 2 previous miscarriages, so we decided to keep the news private for the first trimester. I told our mothers, making them promise to keep it secret. Martha fully respected our wishes. When we finally announced the pregnancy, George took our decision to keep it private personally. He told Theo that I obviously had issues with men due to my history with my father. When we decided not to find out the baby's sex before the birth, because we wanted it to be a surprise, George made a horrific accusation. He told Theo that the real reason we didn't want to know was that I planned to have an abortion if it was a boy. I was shocked when Theo told me what his father had said. For the record, I was secretly hoping for a boy. I have wonderful men in my life, and I would have been thrilled with a son. We simply wanted the surprise factor of not knowing until the birth. My pregnancy was physically difficult. I struggled to gain weight due to severe morning sickness. I experienced occasional cramping and bleeding that required bed rest at various points. My doctor monitored me closely, and despite the challenges, we made it to 33 weeks, which my doctor described as unusual but not concerning, given our continuous monitoring. Throughout my pregnancy, George's behavior worsened. When he learned that I was planning a natural birth, he constantly complained about my decision. He kept saying that if a C-section was good enough for Martha, it should be good enough for me. What he conveniently left out was that Martha's C-section was medically necessary due to serious complications. The procedure was so difficult it led to a hysterectomy, which is why Theo is an only child. George's comments became increasingly cruel. He told Theo that our baby probably wouldn't live long, knowing full well about my previous losses. He said my pregnancy would make me fat and Theo would stop being attracted to me. The comments continued, each one more hurtful than the last. Throughout all of this, Theo would typically respond by saying his father was just joking, or change the subject. He'd spent his whole life dealing with George's behavior by filtering it out or mentally checking out of conversations. I understood that this was a coping mechanism, but it meant that George's behavior continued unchecked. After some particularly nasty comments early in our relationship, I made the decision to minimize my time around George. Theo supported this choice, though he continued to visit his parents regularly. As my pregnancy progressed, we had serious conversations about George's temper and agreed that our child would never be left alone with him. Now, to the delivery. I went into labor 3 weeks ago. We headed to the hospital where I planned to give birth with minimal intervention, supported by my midwife. Labor was hard, long, and painful. After about 13 hours, I was exhausted but progressing. I'd given specific instructions to the hospital staff not to allow anyone into the delivery room except those I had approved. This was partly because I was afraid my estranged father might find out I was in labor and show up. The hospital assured me they would respect my wishes. Despite these precautions, 13 hours into my labor, the door burst open, and George and Martha walked in. I couldn't believe it. There I was in the most vulnerable position imaginable, dealing with contractions from a baby who we later learned weighed 9 pounds, when the one person I absolutely did not want to see walked in. After 13 hours of labor pain and months of verbal abuse from him, he was the last person I wanted to see. I yelled at him, calling him an abusive person and demanding he leave immediately. I told him nothing was coming out of my body while he was in the room, and if he wanted to meet his grandchild, he needed to leave now. George turned purple with rage, lunged towards me, and raised his hand. It was clear he intended to hit me, although he hesitated when he seemed to realize we were in a hospital. After what felt like a pause as he decided what to do, Theo grabbed him from behind and restrained him. Theo is significantly bigger than his father, about 50 pounds heavier and 6 inches taller. The look in Theo's eyes made me think he might seriously hurt his father if no one intervened. Thankfully, hospital security arrived quickly and removed George. Martha stayed behind, profusely apologizing and crying. The stress of the confrontation caused our baby to become distressed. I started to panic, which stalled my labor. The medical team had to intervene with various techniques to help me progress again. 2 hours after George was removed, our daughter was born with Theo, my mother, and Martha present. She was healthy despite the complications, and we named her Aria. In the aftermath, Theo and I have been struggling with what to do. I want nothing to do with George, but this creates several problems. Aria is partially paralyzed due to a car accident years ago. She depends on George financially and physically for her mobility. If we cut George off completely, we're effectively cutting off Martha, too. Theo would lose both his parents, and Aria would only know my mother as a grandmother, as my father is already out of the picture. There's also the legal issue. Part of me wants to report George's attempted assault to the police. However, our state has a 3 strikes law for violent offenders. What Theo never told me until recently is that George has 2 prior convictions for domestic violence, both stemming from incidents with Theo when he was a minor. There were several other arrests where Martha dropped the charges. The physical abuse apparently stopped only when Theo got big enough to defend himself and his mother. If I press charges now, George will almost certainly go to prison for a long time under the 3 strikes rule. While he deserves consequences for his actions, I don't want to be responsible for Martha losing her caregiver and financial support. I also don't want Aria's birth to be forever associated with sending her grandfather to prison. After we left the hospital, we told George directly that we didn't want him near me or the baby. He ignored this and showed up at our house with Martha a few days later. Theo physically blocked him from entering while allowing Martha in. Since then, Martha has visited us alone several times, thanks to Theo, but George hasn't returned. I want George completely out of our lives, the same way my father is, but I don't want to lose Martha. And I don't want Theo to lose his mother. I don't want my daughter to not have grandparents on her father's side. But I also don't want my daughter around someone who tried to assault her mother during childbirth and who has a documented history of violence. There's no other family who can take care of Martha, and if George does end up in jail, we'd have to take care of her full-time, when we now also have to take care of a baby and 2 full-time jobs. I wish it were as easy as reporting him and having George out of our lives, but this is so much more complex than that. Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe. New stories every day. Update 1. There were a lot of ideas in the comments, and I have to thank you for those. But in these 2 weeks, there have been major developments I wanted to update you on. The morning after my post, Theo approached me about the situation with George before I could even bring it up. I was exhausted from caring for Aria and getting very little sleep, but he insisted we needed to talk. What he told me shocked me. Theo revealed that George's behavior at the hospital wasn't the first time his father had tried to physically intimidate me. Apparently, at our wedding reception 2 years ago, George had gotten drunk and made threatening movements towards me when I was alone getting drinks for Theo and myself. Theo's cousin witnessed this and intervened, pulling George away before I even noticed. His cousin and Theo decided not to tell me so as not to ruin our wedding day. For 2 years, I'd been around someone who wanted to hurt me and didn't even know it. Theo apologized repeatedly for keeping it from me, explaining that he thought it was an isolated incident caused by alcohol. Theo and I talked for hours that day. Theo admitted he'd spent his whole life normalizing his father's behavior, making excuses and mentally checking out when things got bad. George trying to assault me while I was giving birth to our daughter was the wake-up call he needed. Together, we made the decision to figure out a way to get George out of our lives, and to take care of Martha. The next challenge was talking to Martha. Theo visited her alone the following day while I stayed home with Aria. Martha's reaction wasn't what we expected. Instead of defending George, Martha also agreed we needed to do something about George. While she'd been planning to leave George for months, the incident at the hospital was her final straw. She revealed she'd been secretly working with a disability advocate and had secured accessible housing in a community for people with physical disabilities. She'd also been saving money from her part-time remote job, which George didn't know about. Martha explained she had stayed with George all these years partly due to her physical limitations and financial dependence, but mostly out of fear. The day George tried to hit me at the hospital was the day she realized he would never change, and she couldn't enable his behavior any longer. Theo was stunned. He'd had no idea his mother was planning this escape. Martha asked for our help with her transition, which we immediately agreed to. She moved into her new apartment last week, with Theo and some friends helping to move her belongings while George was at work. George's reaction to Martha leaving was exactly what we feared. He showed up at our house the next day, banging on the door and yelling accusations. He claimed I had poisoned his family against him and stolen his wife and son. He demanded to know where Martha was. We didn't open the door and called the police. By the time they arrived, George was gone, but we filed a report documenting the incident and the one at the hospital. The officers taking our statement suggested we file a restraining order, which we did immediately. We shared the documentation of the incident at the hospital and Theo's account of George's history of violence. The temporary order was granted, and we're awaiting the hearing date for the permanent order. Martha is adjusting to her newfound independence. She seems more relieved in some ways, despite the challenges of living alone with her physical limitations. She's been visiting us regularly to spend time with Aria, thanks to Theo picking her up, and the relationship between her and Theo has strengthened now that George doesn't control their interactions. As for the charges for the incident at the hospital, we don't know what will happen now. The restraining order offers some protection, and we want to see if that's enough for George to stay away. Martha is supportive of whatever decision we make, but she's hoping she has some time to settle into her new life before potentially dealing with a criminal trial where she might need to testify. I've received some negative messages from George's family, accusing me of breaking up a marriage and denying a grandfather access to his granddaughter. Theo has been handling these calls and messages, telling them to F off. Some family members have been understanding, but the ones who have sided with George have gotten appropriate responses. Aria is doing great, and it's beautiful spending time with her. She is growing fast, or so it seems, because she eats very well. She does not let us sleep much, but also has her very long naps. Theo is an amazing father, and watching him with our daughter reminds me daily that the cycle of abuse can be broken. Now I'm just waiting to get new updates on what's happening to come back with another update. It might be a few days or a few weeks, but I'm not going to leave you hanging without information. Update 2. Can't believe it's been over a month of me being a mother already. It's crazy how time flies. The restraining order hearing took place 2 weeks ago. Theo, Martha, and I testified about George's behavior, including the incident at the hospital and his history of violence. The judge granted a 1-year restraining order, prohibiting George from coming within 150 meters of our house, Aria, Theo, or me. But here's George's reaction to losing both his wife and the court case. 3 days after the hearing, Martha's new apartment was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, but her personal belongings were strewn everywhere. The police couldn't prove it was George, as there were no witnesses or cameras, but we all knew it was him. Martha was shaken but refused to let fear dictate her decisions. She installed a security system and continued living independently. Then we learned more. Theo's aunt, George's sister, contacted us to talk about her brother's past. According to Theo's aunt, George had been violent long before his marriage to Martha. In his early 20s, he dated a woman who ended up in the hospital after what was reported as a fall down the stairs. George was questioned but never charged. The aunt had witnessed George's violent temper with this woman before the incident and always suspected he was responsible. Most disturbing was what she told us about Theo's birth. Martha's emergency C-section and subsequent hysterectomy weren't just medical complications, as we'd been told. According to the aunt, George shoved Martha during an argument when she was 9 months pregnant, causing her to fall and leading to the emergency surgery. Hospital staff suspected abuse, but Martha denied everything, claiming she'd tripped. Theo was devastated to learn this. The story of his birth had been a complete lie. The aunt provided old family letters and photos that backed up her claims, including correspondence between relatives expressing their concern over George's treatment of Martha before and after Theo's birth. With this new information, we went to the police to add it to our existing reports. The officer taking our statement was concerned enough to assign a detective to investigate the pattern of behavior. The detective interviewed Martha, who finally confirmed the truth about Theo's birth and the years of abuse she'd endured. She shared how George had controlled every aspect of her life since the accident that caused her paralysis, which she now admitted wasn't an accident at all. George had been driving recklessly during an argument, intentionally scaring her when he crashed the car. Her spinal injury was the result, but she protected him, telling everyone he'd swerved to avoid hitting an animal. For 30 years, Martha had hidden the full extent of George's abuse. Her recent decision to leave him hadn't been as sudden as she'd initially portrayed. She'd been planning it for years, slowly gathering the courage and resources. The district attorney is working on adding all of this to the incident at the hospital, plus potentially reopening investigations into the historical incidents. The 3 strikes law is still a factor, meaning George could face considerable prison time if convicted. Meanwhile, George has been retaliating in other ways. He called Theo's workplace, making false accusations that almost cost him his job, until his colleagues testified to his good character. He's been spreading rumors in their community that Martha left him because she was having an affair. He created fake social media accounts to harass me and post baseless accusations about our family. Theo began having nightmares about his childhood, remembering incidents he'd repressed. He's struggling with the guilt of not protecting his mother sooner and with the rage at himself for letting George near Aria, however briefly. I know there are people who will think Martha deserves what happened to her for letting the abuse go on for so long. But we are not going to leave her alone, now. It's good that it all came out now because we have a decent shot to confront George, all together. We've installed security cameras at our house and Martha's apartment. Martha has started therapy to process the decades of abuse and her new independence. She's also joined a support group for survivors of domestic violence, which is good. Despite the challenges of living independently with her physical limitations, she is happy for this new chapter. We have a meeting scheduled with the district attorney next week to discuss possible charges against George. We're looking forward to this meeting. Update 3. We've reached what feels like a resolution, though not the one we expected. First, the legal developments. After meeting with the district attorney, they outlined a strategy that could potentially put him behind bars for a good amount of time. The evidence, including multiple witness statements from hospital staff, was substantial. Given George's history of prior convictions and the new information about his history of violence, the DA felt confident about the case. George was arrested and charged with attempted assault. Due to the 3 strikes law and the circumstances of the crime, he was denied bail and remained in custody, awaiting trial. What we didn't anticipate was George's health situation. 2 weeks after his arrest, he collapsed in jail and was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his right side and with significant cognitive impairment. Doctors believe the stroke was likely caused by untreated hypertension and decades of heavy alcohol use, coupled with the stress of the situation. The criminal case has become complicated due to his medical condition. The DA is still pursuing the charges, but George's lawyer is arguing that he is not competent to stand trial. Evaluations are ongoing, but medical experts suggest his impairment is permanent and severe. Ultimately, George was transferred from the hospital to a state-run long-term care facility for inmates with medical needs. The irony of his situation now being physically dependent on others, after having caused Martha's paralysis, has not been lost on any of us. Martha visited him once in the hospital before he was transferred to the state facility. She told us he grew agitated during the visit. Martha asked him, "How does that feel, bastard?" She never visited him again after that. Theo has processed much of his childhood trauma through therapy. He's become an advocate for domestic violence awareness, particularly focused on helping children who witness abuse. As for Aria, she's thriving. At 5 months old, she's hitting all her milestones and bringing joy wherever she goes. He's the father I always knew he would be, tender, protective, and present. The cycle of abuse that plagued our childhoods has been decisively broken. We've made the difficult but necessary decision to remain no contact with George, regardless of his medical state. The restraining order is still in place, and we've made our wishes clear to the medical and legal authorities handling his case. Some people might see this as callous, but we see it as necessary protection for our family. George showed no remorse for his actions before his stroke, and his medical condition doesn't erase the danger he posed to us, especially Aria. George will never meet Aria, no matter if he gets put to trial eventually, or if he ever recovers. He will never be a part of our family gatherings. We will never visit him or allow him access into our lives in any way. For those who suggested that therapy would help George change, I want to point out that Martha tried for years to get him help. He refused all offers of counseling, denied his violent tendencies despite multiple convictions, and blamed everyone else for his actions. His stroke may have physically limited his ability to hurt others, but it hasn't transformed him into a different person. Martha visits us weekly now, building a beautiful relationship with Aria. My mother and Martha have become friends, giving Aria 2 loving grandmothers. Theo's relationship with his mother has deepened now that George doesn't control their interactions. We don't know what may happen now, since his whole trial has been put in a sort of limbo. I don't know if he's been lucky or not. On the one hand, he has completely avoided, or at least for a while, trial. But on the other hand, he is a sort of vegetable. Update 4. Maybe the trial against George was put on hold, waiting for him to recover some of his mental faculties, but universal, karmic, God's judgment, or whatever, didn't stop. George has departed from this world. And if there is a version of hell, I hope it's one where he is poked by loud red demons all the time. At least that's the one I choose to believe when I imagine where he will be spiritually. Physically, he's buried in his hometown, which is where the few people who have continued on his side have taken him. There were 3 people at his funeral, and neither Theo nor Martha went to pay their respects. Theo has told me that that person doesn't even deserve the respect of a god. In the end, we have fulfilled that thing about Aria not meeting her grandfather. And thanks to fate, she'll never have to meet him. Aria will only have people who love her and will never have to live in the same world as George. It's not the karma George deserved. He deserved to spend years in prison for all the harm he caused, but karma has been more convenient for everyone. That's my take on this. I don't rejoice in anyone's death, but if anyone deserved to die, it was my father-in-law. And having done it alone, even more so.